I think most of what I'm going to talk about would work in most cultures, but certainly some things might not apply to the Middle East or Asia because those are cultures that are very different, and I have no personal experience with either of them. So I just wanted to start with that. Yeah, really, I want to break my time into two main sections. The first will be bigger than the second. And the first section is just how to approach and prepare. So how to approach and prepare preaching and ministering in a cross-cultural context. And then the second part is going to be more practical. What are some practical things to remember, to consider, tips that can help? But that'll definitely be shorter. So yeah, I want to jump in with how do we go about approaching and preparing? And I think that's actually the more important side than the practical side. And if we do this well, the other part, you'll get through the mistakes that you make in communication and relationship. So I want to start with reading a scripture. And most of the points I'm going to bring up about how to approach and prepare, I'm going to pull out of this scripture. So I'm going to reference it a number of times. So it's 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 23. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19 to 23. And Paul's writing to the church in Corinth. And this is what he says to them. He says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all means possible, I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." So I think that passage is loaded with things that help us in regards to ministering cross-culturally. I think that the key thing I want to start is right at the beginning of the passage. Number one, how do I approach and prepare? Start off in humility. Start off in humility. Paul writes, "I have made myself a slave to everyone." I don't think you can choose a more humble position than that. It's not just making himself a slave, it's making himself a slave to everyone. Yeah, it's almost hard to wrap your mind around that, but essentially it's in each relationship I'm starting, I'm making the other person my master, and I'm going to take the position of a slave. That is quite the position to go into ministry in. And I think it's critical that we start there in that position of humility. The fact is, you don't know what you don't know. And cross-culturally, there's going to be lots of things you don't know. And not only do we not know what we don't know about the other culture, we all begin very blind to our own cultural lenses. So each one of us, whatever part of the world we're from, whatever culture we're from, you've maybe heard this illustration before, but we wear a set of glasses. And they through that set of glasses, we gain our worldview. But our worldview is constantly being modified. The focus is being adjusted by the glasses that we're wearing. And it can become very difficult to even recognize your own glasses, your own lenses that you're seeing the world through, because they're so intertwined with our cultural perspectives that we've grown up with, from where we come from. And so that just increases the importance of starting off in humility. And, like Paul did, just notification here. We got more minutes. Yeah, and as you start off in that position, it allows you to learn. It allows you with time to see your own cultural lenses. And I would say for myself now, having spent many years every day in a cross-cultural context, it's amazing to me how much I still, on a fairly regular basis, I just realize, you know what, I'm seeing this, but I'm seeing this from a Western, Canadian, Mennonite, whatever my background is, perspective. I would say it was only after being in South Africa 4 years that really, for the first time when I went back to Canada, I mean, we've gone back and forth a number of times, but this was the first time where we'd gone back and joined into the life of the church there, that for the first time we saw lots of things we just assumed were regular Christian practices. And now they just really, we realized they weren't. They were just regular Canadian practices that the church does, but they weren't fundamentally Christian. But it took us 4 years out of that context to see that that actually wasn't Christian. It was just Canadian. And so my point is that those lenses are strong, and it takes time to identify them, and it takes time to be able to see from another angle. And so because of that, it's extremely important that we start off our approach to preaching, our approach to ministering cross-culturally is done in humility. Second thing, so number one is starting in humility. Number two, in order to approach and prepare well cross-culturally, is to be flexible. To be flexible. Paul writes, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. That's very interesting to me. He easily could have said to the Jews, I am a Jew, which of course he was. But he doesn't. He says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. So first, that tells me that he's actually changed his own identity to such a degree that he no longer self-identifies as primarily a Jew. He's a follower of Christ. But nonetheless, when he wants to minister or preach to the Jews, he becomes again like what he once was, like a Jew. And I think this is really important, so that in anything that is not going to be offensive or of primary importance or sinful or things like that, in all of those ways possible, I become like a Jew or like the people group that I'm ministering to in every way that is possible without obviously breaking scriptural principles. And I think that's critical, that we take an approach that we're not trying to have them meet us where we're at, but we're going to meet them on their side. You know, there's a cultural divide whenever you're engaging cross-culturally, and we're not expecting them to jump to our side of the cultural divide, but we're going to go meet them on their side. And that is a lot more difficult than it seems, especially because for most of us, we're coming from a Western culture, and Western culture, more than any other culture in the world, has propagated itself into other cultures. And so initially, there will actually be probably more common ground in a Western cultural approach than in an African cultural approach or another culture, just because of how Western culture has propagated itself all over the world. But if we stay there, if we allow sort of ourselves to be a bit lazy and not be like Paul's example of being a Jew to the Jews, actually without being intentional, we sort of adopt the old missionary model of, we're not just preaching the gospel, we're preaching the Western European version of the gospel. And that's critical, that we try to take the approach of Paul and, you know, instead I preach Christ and him crucified, to keep it simple. We'll talk more about that later. But basically, the expectation is not for them to meet us on our side, but to meet them on their side. One easy example of this would be, many cultures have a very different value of time and precision than Western values. For Western values, time and precision are of utmost importance. Most other cultures, those two things are not very important. And if we're not going to be flexible, the meeting might be starting an hour, 2 hours late, and we're frustrated before we're even up for ministering or preaching. And actually, that's a reflection of our own values and personhood from our Western background, as opposed to anything to do with the gospel. You know, there's nothing in the gospel that requires us to start everything on time. So I think that's just one example of where, if instead we choose to be flexible, it helps us to approach and prepare the right way, that when the unexpected happens, as it often does, we're able to go with it. And then number 3 is really quite connected with this. So number 1 is start off in humility. Number 2 is be flexible. Number 3 is build a bridge to their culture. Build a bridge to their culture. So if I'm going to meet them on their side and not expect them to come to my side, I'm going to have to build bridges to get across in order to get to their side, in order to meet them where they are at. And so we still have that same idea of Paul: to the Jews I became like a Jew, to those under the law I became like one who is under the law, to those not under the law like those not under the law. But if we're going to build bridges, some very important bridges for us to build. Number one would be relationship. Number one would be a relationship. Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 8. 1 Thessalonians 2, verse 8. We were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. That's huge. If we're going to build bridges cross-culturally, we need to realize that actually Western culture has a lower value on relationship than most other cultures. And when you're from a Western culture, that's the kind of thing that's hard to see, because of course I value relationship, but you value it less than people of other cultures do. And Paul's approach was to not just share the gospel, but to share his very life. And so if you get an opportunity to minister cross-culturally, take that into account with how you approach and how you prepare. If you're able, get together ahead of time with the pastor or the elders, go over to their home, have them into your home. If things get delayed, use that time to build a relationship, get to know people. Really make it an emphasis that actually probably just as much as I'm coming to share the gospel, I'm coming to share my life. And as I do that, that's going to help me to build a relationship. And especially cross-culturally, my opinion is that it's relationship that'll take you through the cultural flashpoints that inevitably come up. If the person knows you love them and vice versa, when there's friction, when there's problems that previously would have separated people again, that's just white people doing their thing, that relationship will pull you through that. So it's huge that we use Paul's approach of sharing not just the gospel, but our very lives as well. And that's a huge bridge that'll help us to meet people where they're at. Second, and quite connected to it, is to build a bridge of intentionally learning about the people. It's very important to have an approach of, I want to learn about the culture, about the people group I'm going to connect with and minister to. I love Paul's approach when he gets to the city of Athens. In Acts 17:22, it says, Paul then stood up in a meeting of the Areopagus and said, people of Athens, I see that in every way you're very religious. And so we know just before that he's gone, he's taken note of all these idols. He finds an idol to an unknown God. And then when he gets up to minister, to preach, he doesn't just jump into his message. No, as he's learned about this city and about their beliefs, he uses that to connect with them where they're at. And so it's critical that we learn about the people. And as we learn about the people, it's going to enable us to build bridges to them, to find ways to connect with where they're at in their understanding, in their thinking, in their view of God, in those sorts of things. As well, in regards to building a bridge, it's really, it means so much to people if you're able just to stretch yourself a bit in regards to language. I'd really encourage you, if you get a chance to preach in another culture, try to at least greet them in their own language. So you can ask whoever's invited you ahead of time, give me a greeting in your language. You know what? It doesn't matter if you butcher it. The fact that you tried is going to speak volumes. I wouldn't be able to do it now, but when I was in Brazil, I had at least one or two sentences in Portuguese I'd memorized. And you know what? You do it, they laugh at you because inevitably you do it pretty poorly. But it's not the point. You're just winning hearts. And so it's really important to do your best. If you're in the township, even just to start off with Mulwaney, one single word is better than nothing. So to greet people in their own language it's a huge bridge builder, and just helps people feel like this person's not just here with their own agenda, they care about me. And so that's a very important thing to do. Then also in regards to building a bridge, engage ahead of time with whoever's invited you or the pastor to learn a little bit about how to do protocol or how to do honoring in their culture. Now, in African culture in particular, honoring is very important. And this is, again, one of those things that Western value, we don't really care about honoring very much. And in fact, we get quite awkward with it. But actually, it's one of those areas that African culture better reflects biblical values than our Western culture. So 1 Peter 2:17, as an example, simply says, honor everyone. Off the top of my head, I think it's in Hebrews, it says, outdo one another in showing honor. You know, we struggle with that in Western culture. We find it awkward to honor people. Yet actually it's a strong biblical value. And because it's a strong value in African culture, if we are able to stretch ourselves in that, it just builds a bridge to meet people at. And then in regards to protocol, just ask the person, what's an appropriate way to greet? What's an appropriate way to address the people? And again, it's taking that posture of like Paul, I make myself a slave to everyone. And so just your posture and how you do that with the leadership is already going to build you a bridge. And then as you do that again with the church or the congregation, you know, following, I greet you all in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. I greet the pastors. I greet the mamas. I greet the Sunday school. Those would be some of the very typical things you would do here. As you do those things, they know you're stretching yourself and you're building a bridge and you're winning hearts by doing those things. So that's kind of the third thing I would say in regards to how to prepare, in regards to how to approach it, is to build a bridge. So start off in humility, be flexible, build a bridge to the culture that you're going to connect with. And then number four is not quite so much from this passage of 1 Corinthians 9, but especially at first, okay, if it's the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times you've gone into this particular context, I'd really encourage you to bring a word of encouragement, seeking mutual edification. So to keep that short, bring a word of encouragement, as opposed to trying to direct, trying to correct, those sorts of things. Go with intentionality to bring a word of encouragement. So Paul, when he's writing to the Romans, and remember now, this is a church that he did not plant the church in Rome. He's never visited the church in Rome, but he feels called to write a letter to this church. And in the very first chapter, he writes about his hope to go to them. And he writes this in Romans 1:11 and 12. He says, "For I long to visit you so that I can bring you some spiritual gift that'll help you grow strong in the Lord. When we get together, I want to encourage you in your faith, but I also want to be encouraged by yours, by your faith." And so Paul's approach as he's writing this church, a church where he is not the spiritual father in the sense of the planter of the church, is very much to go and to be an encouragement to the church, and then also that there would be some mutual edification. So he's going to learn from them and what God has done in them as he brings a word of encouragement. And so especially, you know, the first while that you go into a church, even though you might on your first visit see, hey, this is unhealthy, you know, this could change, this could use some direction. I would encourage you, start off with bringing a word of encouragement. With time, as relationship is built, as bridges are built, you know, you'll be able to work on those other things. And often you're better off, you might not be the right person to address those things anyways. As the outsider, you might be way better off working with the local leadership team, helping them to understand in private than you publicly addressing something that you see that needs to be worked on or adjusted. A common phrase that's used in ministry in Africa, or really it's a cultural phrase from Africa that's helpful in ministry, I should say, is that slow is fast and fast is slow. And so if you remember my name, you can remember that little saying, slow is fast and fast is slow. And really what that's saying is, if you want to work well with African cultures, if you take an approach of trying to go quickly and move quickly, you will find you will go a very small distance. But instead, if you'll take an approach of slow is fast, and you will build relationship, and you will get to know one another, and you'll come into each other's homes, as that relationship is built, as that trust is built, as that, exactly precisely the illustration that Joe used at the beginning. Take that 5 years and put those roots deep. And suddenly you will see that thing growing. What'd you say, 90 centimeters a day or something crazy, or 30 centimeters a day, whatever it was. If you are willing to, that's exactly what that illustration is about. If you're willing to start off slow, do the groundwork, let the roots grow deep, you will find actually there will be explosion of growth later. But if you start the other way, you're going to find you're not going to go anywhere. So that's really significant. And that's also why it's very important to go with an approach of bringing a word of encouragement, especially the first significant period of time. Then number 5, lastly, is sort of why do this? Why put in all that effort? They already know English. Why do I want to have to learn Xhosa? They already understand Western values because I see them watch our movies in the evenings. Why put in this effort? It's difficult. And I love how Paul finishes in verse 23. He says, I do all of this. So he's just said, I make myself a slave. To the Jews, I become like a Jew. To those who are weak, I become weak. Why? Verse 23, I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. That is critical, that we understand. We do this for the sake of the gospel. Paul wasn't just doing this because, I don't know, he really wanted to. He was doing it because he recognized that for the sake of the gospel, if I am willing to put in as much effort as I can to be the one who changes, to be the one who goes across the bridge, I will see far more fruit. I will share in the blessings. But if instead I expect them to be the ones to cross the bridge, then the gospel is not going to go, it's not going to advance in the same way. And recognizing that, look, being the one who's going to build the bridge and trying to get across that bridge, it's often going to be awkward. And that's okay. I would rather for myself it be awkward than to make it awkward or difficult for the person I'm preaching to. And so accept that that's part of what happens when you minister cross-culture and you want to meet them where they're at, is there's going to be a bit of a sense of awkwardness. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 2. 1 Corinthians 2 verse 2, Paul writes and he says, For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I love that. Paul could have come and said, I studied under Gamaliel. I'm the top Pharisee in my region. He could have come and explained all the prophecies of the Old Testament. He could have explained all the covenants of the Old Testament. And he could have gone into incredible depth. But he just said, I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except for Christ and him crucified. And I think that's really, really important, is that we remember why we do this. We do this for the sake of the gospel, and we keep that the emphasis. And because of that, I'm motivated to step out. I'm motivated to walk across that bridge, to build the relationships with the people group that God's given me an opportunity to minister to. So those are kind of the 5 things I want to say in regards to how to approach or how to prepare to minister or preach cross-culturally. Then I'd like to just give a few practical tips. These will especially be related to working here in Africa. And then we can have some question and answer after that. So practical tip number 1, especially at first, again, do not go alone. Bring at least one other person with you, ideally a team. First, we see this consistently in the New Testament. Jesus sent them out in pairs. Paul all the time sends teams or groups together to go and minister. It's very easy if you go by yourself to misread a situation, to misunderstand a situation, to have someone else with. Ideally, it's someone else who's from the culture that you're going to minister to, that you have strong relationship with. so that afterwards you're able to ask them questions. So for me, when I got here to South Africa, the first couple of years, really the biggest thing I did is 3, 4 guys, I drew very close to them. One of them actually eventually became my brother-in-law. His name's Mwande. Super helpful to have a guy like that, or a few guys like that you can ask any question to. Your relationship with them is strong enough that you can ask them questions about circumcision and they're not going to get awkward. They're going to understand why you're asking it, and it's going to allow you to understand more and more. Then when you are able to bring guys like that, especially with you, it's not unusual that in a cross-cultural context, something will happen and you'll be like, I just don't understand what's happening here. Maybe it looks sketchy even. Maybe it looks like this doesn't seem right. It's going to be very difficult for you to learn about that, to understand what happened there if you don't have someone with you who later you're able to ask, hey, halfway through the meeting, when this person said this, the whole atmosphere in the room changed. What were they saying? You know, maybe it wasn't even in English. Maybe it was in their language. So don't go alone. Bring a team. Ideally, have someone with on the team who is from the language or people group that you're going to minister in. Number 2, expect translation. It's a real important practical tip. It affects massively how you prepare. Expect there to be translation. Pretty much any Xhosa church you're going to go into in the township here is going to have a translator for you, unless the audience is very young. But if there's an older group of people in the audience, the pastor is almost always going to ask for a translator in order for them to be able to understand you. But for you, that means a number of things. It means you're going to need less material. You know, if you prepare a regular length preach and you haven't considered this ahead of time, you're going to be preaching a very long time. It also means it's very important to speak slower than normal and to speak clearly so your translator can understand what you're saying. For myself especially, because I also now have an accent, if I am not very intentional in that, my translator, he's often just going to look at me confused. And if he's confused and he's got the strongest English in the group, you can imagine where everybody else is. So be intentional about speaking slower, even just using simpler vocabulary. It's helpful in a cross-cultural context. Just think for yourself, if there's another language you've ever tried to learn, if someone's using more advanced vocabulary in that language, you just simply aren't going to be able to understand. I would also encourage you, as much as you're able, engage with that translator ahead of time and go through your major ideas. That way your translator can ask you questions. Okay, what do you mean, you know, God disciplines those he loves? Break that down for me. If you can talk through, let your translator ask you questions about your material before you preach, that translator, he's going to do a way better job translating for you. Then I would say too, especially if you're in a bit of a new context, I've seen this happen enough times that I'm going to say this, and that is, don't get frustrated, or even worse, don't belittle your translator. I've seen it happen a number of times where guys, they just get frustrated because they can see their translator is struggling, and they kind of actually publicly, they belittle their translator. Well, their translator is from the group they're trying to reach. So without realizing it, you're insulting everybody. So if your translator is struggling, it's up to you to do what you can to build a bridge, to meet him, to help him, to slow down, to explain again. If maybe his English isn't that strong, and that's okay. You've got to do everything you can to, as you engage with him, the people will feel that's how you're engaging with them. So really value that translator. When you finish, thank your translator. It's not easy translating, especially for guys who don't do it regularly. So that whole translation thing is very important to approach that well. So that's the second thing I would talk about. Third practical tip, and we a little bit touched on this before, but really keep your message simple. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1, so the verse directly before the one we spoke of before. He says, "And so it was with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God." Again, Paul could have used big language, big theology. He put all of that aside. He put the eloquence of being a very well-trained theologian aside, and instead came to them just with humility and simply preached the Christ and Christ crucified. So keep your message simple. Yeah, that's a huge thing that's important in preparing practically. Number 4, as you begin to engage more with the church, don't nitpick on details. Keep that thing in mind of majoring on majors, minoring on minors. Don't nitpick on details. Things that are details that you're able to just use their language or their approach, do it. So an easy example of that would be in Josh Gen, we call our leaders elders. But worldwide, the normal term to use is pastor. When you're starting off, don't go into the front of the church in the township and call the senior pastor an elder. Without realizing it, you're actually going to be belittling him. It's not going to make sense to them why you would do that, and you're just shooting yourself in the foot. So it's a detail that we in Josh Gen use the term elder and not pastor. So on details, don't nitpick. I'm not saying with time and in relationship, you aren't able to start a discussion. Okay, what does the New Testament say about the role of an elder, and how does that work with a bishop or a pastor? But don't start there. Yeah, in general, don't nitpick. Use the opportunity instead to follow what's normal in their culture. Then just a few things to avoid. So this might sound strange, but especially at first, just avoid humor. Humor does not translate easily across cultures. Now, if you've got a fair amount of experience, and if you're able to, if you have a cultural translator, someone who knows the other culture, and you're able to bounce a joke off them ahead of time, that can work. But be cautious. You're far more likely to shoot yourself in the foot with humor than you are to build a bridge. So I'd strongly encourage you, as you're starting off especially a newer cross-cultural relationship, just avoid humor. It's not worth it. Yeah. Number 2, avoid cultural and historical illustrations. Avoid cultural and historical illustrations. Any illustration where there's an assumed common understanding is highly unlikely not to work. This one was difficult for me. When I first came here, most of my illustrations I realized were either from culture or from history. I love to give an illustration from Caesar this or Alexander the Great that. I realized none of those work. There is not the same understanding of history. In many cases, especially in preaching into Africa, there's not been the same opportunity for education. So your worldview is heavily shaped by that. And you're just losing people by using illustrations that are from culture or from history. Joel, the illustration you gave at the beginning, even an illustration like that, now that one could work, I think, if you had the pictures for it. Okay, because farming translates fairly well if it's basic farming. And if you had the pictures of what that tree looked like with the root system and you explained it well, that could work. But you can see that's about as common ground an illustration as you can use. And even still, I would say without the images, it may not work because they will not have a reference point likely for the type of tree structure that you're trying to describe. So yeah, especially things from sports, from hobbies, from global politics. I remember one of the first times I was preaching here in the township, and it was right after, or not too long after events in the Middle East, and I used Baghdad in my illustration. And it was just looks of complete misunderstanding. And I asked my translator, he says, nobody knows what Baghdad is. And for me, I was like, look, for 10 years, pretty much every day in the global news, they speak about Baghdad. But it doesn't work. So avoid illustrations from culture or from history, and you'll realize that most of your illustrations are from those places. Instead, I would encourage you use biblical illustrations. So if you're preaching out of one passage and you want an illustration, reference another passage that tells, maybe a parable or a story that makes the same point. That's a far better illustration to use, because the church will likely have heard that other story before. And so you're bringing in an illustration now that they're able to connect with. So if you want to use another illustration, use one that connects with another biblical passage, or in particular a story or narrative. And that would be a better way to do it. I would also just very practically, not just in Africa, but in most cross-cultural contexts, I'd avoid anything to do with alcohol as a reference or a joke, or it's just going to be misunderstood. Anything to do with dating, boyfriends, girlfriends, those kind of things, because those are things that commonly have very different practices in different cultures. And if you talk about, you got together with a couple friends and had a glass of wine Friday night, you might destroy your entire morning just by that. So I know it's very specific, but here in Cape Town, if you're going to go into Google A2 and you're going to talk about having had a beer on the weekend, you've killed your ministry before you've even started. So very practically, I would just avoid those things completely. Then maybe the last practical tip I'll give, and then we'll jump into question and answer, it's just dress code. Again, for me, this is one of those things where I think Paul would heavily emphasize to the Jews, I became like a Jew. You don't want to put up a barrier because you wanted to wear what was comfortable for you. Wear what's comfortable for them. In China, for like 100 years, missionaries made virtually zero traction until a man named Hudson Taylor went in, and he was the very first missionary who grew his hair out long, put it in a big ponytail, wore the traditional Chinese shoes and outfits. And Hudson Taylor started something called China Inland Mission. And through him today, there's potentially 100 million believers through the churches that he planted. And that was really the key major difference in his approach, was he immersed himself in Chinese culture. And one of the big pieces to that was in regards to clothing. Same thing here. Consider your clothing. If you're going to go into the township here, dress neat. It's normal to dress up for church. So dress neat. Don't wear a regular t-shirt with a big logo. Marcel, your shirt, I wouldn't wear that if I was preaching. Wear something with a collar. Ideally, wear something with sleeves. Short sleeves are just not received the same way. So a collar and sleeves are a good safe bet. If it's winter time, wear a jacket and a tie. If you have tattoos, cover your tattoos. In African culture, tattoos are not considered helpful. I see Eduardo has heard this before, which is interesting because in Brazil, everybody has a tattoo in Brazil. So yeah, it's a bit of a culture clash there. But here, tattoos are just they're not well received. So cover your tattoos when you consider your dress. And so that's just another practical thing I'd strongly advise. Yeah, so that kind of brings me to the end of some of the things I wanted to prepare.